I've always prided myself on being a seasoned hiker, but this time, I wasn't prepared for what I'd face. You see, the forests have their own set of rules, and on that day, deep in the heart of Utah's Wasatch National Forest, I broke them. Here's the chilling twist. It wasn't getting lost that I feared most. It was the feeling of being hunted. I've always been drawn to the isolation of the woods. There's something primal about it, something that strips away the distractions of the modern world and leaves you with nothing but your own thoughts. I never considered it dangerous. Foolish, I know, but I always felt that if I respected nature, it would respect me in return. That's what I told myself when I packed for a solo weekend hike on the Appalachian Trail. I'd done solo trips before, mostly shorter ones, but this time I was craving something deeper, something more remote. The plan was simple: hike in during the day, set up camp by nightfall, and bask in the quiet solitude. No phone, no distractions, just me and the wild. The first few hours of the hike went smoothly. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the path ahead. The air was cool but pleasant, and the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of a squirrel reminded me I wasn't completely alone out there. I felt alive, free. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. The canopy overhead grew denser, muting the sounds of the forest. The trail, once wide and well-trodden, narrowed into a barely discernible path winding through ancient trees. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours, which didn't bother me, until it did. It happened when I stopped for a break near a small creek. I sat on a rock, munching on a granola bar and letting the sound of the water soothe me. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. Not the random crackling of branches in the breeze, but a deliberate, purposeful snap. My head jerked up, eyes scanning the woods around me. Nothing, just trees and the endless, unbroken stillness of the forest. I shook it off. Probably a deer or some small animal moving through the brush. But still, a strange unease settled in my gut. I couldn't pinpoint why, but suddenly, I felt exposed. Like the trees weren't just watching me, but surrounding me, closing in. I decided to move on. As I continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the steady crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Every now and then, I'd hear another crack, a twig, a branch, something breaking underfoot in the distance. It was always behind me. I sped up, my heart thudding in my chest. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to panic. There was nothing there, I told myself. It was just my mind playing tricks. I'd been alone for hours. My brain was trying to make sense of the solitude. But the sounds continued, faint but deliberate. Whatever it wasn't my imagination. I forced myself to stop and listen. I stood completely still, holding my breath, waiting. The silence was so thick, it pressed against my ears. And then, from somewhere deep within the trees, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick, skittish steps of an animal, but slow, methodical, like someone or something was following me. My stomach dropped. I turned around, scanning the path behind me, but saw nothing. The trees stood tall and ominous, their twisted branches reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't alone. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone or something was out there, watching, following. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm. The trail was growing steeper now, winding through thicker underbrush, and I had to focus on not tripping over the tangled roots beneath my feet. The light was starting to fade, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I still hadn't found a good spot to set up camp, and the thought of being out here after dark, with whatever was trailing me, made my skin crawl, another snap, closer this time. My breath hitched. I turned around again, my eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt like the forest itself was alive. its very essence aware of my presence, pressing in on me from all sides. I pushed forward, my heart pounding. The air had grown colder, the once gentle breeze now biting at my skin. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I spotted a small clearing up ahead. Relief washed over me. I could set up camp, build a fire, and hopefully ward off whatever was out there. I hurried into the clearing, my hands shaking as I unpacked my tent. The sun had nearly dipped below the horizon, and the last traces of daylight were fading fast. I worked quickly, setting up the tent and gathering some wood for a fire. The flames sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows across the clearing, but the sense of dread lingered. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkened trees, listening. The sounds had stopped. No more footsteps, no more snapping twigs, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had intensified. I felt eyes on me, hidden just beyond the reach of the firelight, waiting. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of something, someone, watching me from between the trees. My blood ran cold. I blinked, my heart racing, but the figure remained. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, silent, still. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. My mind was racing. What was it? A person? An animal? Something else? The figure shifted, moving slowly, deliberately, deeper into the shadows until it disappeared completely. I strained my eyes, trying to follow it, but it was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. The fire crackled behind me, offering little comfort as the night pressed in around me. Every sound, every rustle of the leaves sent a surge of panic through me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat by the fire, clutching my makeshift torch, watching the woods, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time packing up my camp. As I turned to leave the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the tree where the figure had stood, deep into the bark, was a strange, jagged symbol. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in a forgotten language. I didn't stay long enough to study it. I snapped a quick picture and bolted down the trail, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. To this day, I don't know what followed me in the woods that night. I don't know what that figure was or what the symbol meant. But one thing is certain, the woods are not as empty as they seem. And next time, I won't be going alone. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you? That unsettling prickle on the back of your neck, even when you're alone? Sam had that feeling the entire time he was in the Appalachian forest. It started as a faint unease, but by the time the whispering began, he knew something was out there. And it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Sam wasn't a stranger to the outdoors. As an avid hiker and photographer, he often found solace in nature, preferring the quiet of the mountains to the chaos of the city. This weekend was supposed to be like any other, a solo trip to disconnect from the world, capture some photographs, and bask in the peace of the woods. He arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the crisp air biting at his skin as the sun just began to peek through the dense canopy of pines. The forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As Sam made his way deeper into the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia. After all, he was alone. But as he ventured further, that creeping sensation grew stronger, more insistent. He'd glance over his shoulder now and then, expecting to see someone, or something just beyond the trees. But there was never anything there, yet the forest didn't feel empty. By midday, Sam had hiked several miles and stopped by a stream to rest. He knelt by the water, cupping his hands to take a drink, when he noticed something strange in the reflection. Behind him, just on the edge of the clearing, there was a shadow. Not a person, but a figure, too large to be a human, standing impossibly still. His heart raced. He spun around, but the figure was gone. He stood there, scanning the forest, eyes darting from tree to tree, but there was nothing. The only sound was the rush of the stream and his own labored breathing. Shaking it off, Sam convinced himself it was a trick of the light. He grabbed his camera and decided to continue, but he couldn't escape the growing dread that seemed to seep into his bones. The feeling of being watched had returned, more intense than before. And now, he started hearing things. It began with a faint whispering, barely audible, like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind. The sound seemed deliberate, as if something, or someone, was calling his name. Sam stopped in his tracks, listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Sam. The voice was unmistakable this time. He turned sharply, scanning the trees behind him, but once again, he saw nothing. His pulse quickened, the hair on his arms standing on end. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, the isolation getting to his head. But deep down, he knew better. As the day wore on, the sense of dread only grew stronger. Sam noticed strange things in the forest now, things he hadn't seen before. Trees marked with deep gashes, too high up to be the work of any animal. Odd piles of stones, almost like primitive markers, arranged in patterns that felt intentional and foreboding. And then there were the footsteps. They weren't always there, but every now and then he'd hear them, a soft, deliberate crunching of leaves behind him. Each time he stopped to listen, they stopped too. The first time he heard them, he chalked it up to wildlife, but the cadence was too familiar, too human. His pace quickened as the sky began to darken, the sun dipping lower behind the mountains. Sam knew he needed to make it to his campsite before nightfall, but the trail ahead felt longer, the woods around him more oppressive with each passing moment. And then he saw it again, just a flicker at the corner of his eye. That same shadowy figure from earlier. This time it was closer, standing just a few feet beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the branches. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape seemed to shift, as though it wasn't fully solid. Panic surged through him. Without thinking, Sam bolted down the trail, his footsteps pounding against the earth. He didn't care where he was going anymore, he just needed to get away. But the whispering followed him, growing louder, more insistent, as though the forest itself was closing in around him. By the time Sam reached his campsite, the sun had set, and the woods were bathed in an eerie twilight. He quickly set up his tent, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the poles. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through his body. Whatever was out there, it was still following him, watching him. The whispering hadn't stopped. In fact, it seemed louder now, surrounding him from all directions, but still, he saw no one. He tried to focus on starting a fire, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. As the flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the trees around him, Sam thought he caught a glimpse of movement, something darting between the trees, faster than anything human could move. Sam! The voice was right behind him now. He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. There, at the edge of the firelight, stood the figure. Sam backed away slowly, his mind racing. He fumbled for his camera, snapping a picture in a desperate attempt to document whatever this thing was. But as the flash went off, the figure vanished, gone as if it had never been there. But Sam knew it was still close. He could feel it. Suddenly, the fire went out. Plunged into darkness, Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to grab his flashlight. He flicked it on, but the beam seemed weak, barely cutting through the thick blackness of the forest. The whispering was everywhere now, surrounding him, mocking him, He heard footsteps, fast, deliberate, coming toward him, but he didn't stop. He could hear the thing behind him, moving impossibly fast, its footsteps growing louder, closer. But no matter how fast he went, the thing was always right there, just behind him, just out of sight. And then, just when he thought he couldn't run any longer, he burst into a clearing. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a voice whispered right in his ear.
I've been